Welcome to Indigenous Love Stories. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's begin today's story. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly beneath a pewter sky, where winter clouds gathered like ancient spirits preparing for war. Snow had begun to fall in the early hours before dawn, dusting the pine-covered ridges with crystalline silence. The Yellowstone River carved its relentless path through the valley, its waters running dark and swift, carrying the bitter cold of mountain springs and the promise of treacherous currents that had claimed more than one unwary soul. Kia moved through the forest with the fluid grace of one born to these lands, his moccasined feet finding purchase on frost-slicked stones without disturbing so much as a twig. The Crow warrior had been tracking elk for 3 days, following ancient paths his grandfather had shown him when the world seemed simpler, when the boundaries between his people's territory and the encroaching settlements were clearly drawn in earth and stone rather than written on papers that meant nothing to the wind. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he paused beside a towering pine, its bark scarred by lightning from some long-ago storm. Something had changed in the forest's rhythm. The usual morning chorus of birds had fallen silent, replaced by an undercurrent of tension that made the hair on his arms rise beneath his buckskin shirt. Years of living close to the land had taught him to read such signs, to understand that nature spoke in whispers to those who knew how to listen. The sound reached him then, faint but unmistakable, a child's cry, high and desperate, carried on the wind like a prayer torn from innocent lips. Kia's dark eyes sharpened, scanning the tree line as he moved toward the riverbank with increased urgency. The cry came again, weaker this time, nearly swallowed by the rushing water's eternal song. Through the bare branches of winter willows, he saw her. A small figure struggled in the river's merciless embrace, her pale dress billowing around her like a water lily caught in a storm. The child could not have been more than 7 years old, her golden hair streaming behind her as the current pulled her toward the rapids downstream. Her small arms flailed against the water's power, but the river was ancient and strong, fed by snowmelt and winter rains that had no mercy for the fragile or the lost. Kia's mind raced as he assessed the situation with the tactical precision of a warrior. The child had perhaps minutes before the current would sweep her into the white water where jagged rocks waited like hungry teeth. The riverbank here was steep, carved away by countless seasons of flooding, offering few handholds for rescue. Ice had formed along the edges where the water moved more slowly, creating a treacherous rim that could trap the unwary beneath its deceptively beautiful surface. Without hesitation, he began stripping away his outer garments, his movements swift and economical. The beaded vest his sister had made for him fell to the snow-covered ground, followed by his knife belt and the sacred medicine pouch that had belonged to his father. The cold bit into his skin like a living thing, but he had endured worse during vision quests in the high mountains, where winter tested a man's spirit as much as his flesh. The child's head disappeared beneath the surface for a terrifying moment before bobbing up again, her face pale as moonlight against the dark water. She was weakening, her struggles becoming less coordinated as the cold sapped her strength. Kia could see the exact spot where the river would claim her if he failed to act within the next heartbeat. He dove. The water struck him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and sending shockwaves through every nerve. The current immediately seized him, trying to drag him downstream toward the same fate that awaited the child. But Kia had swum in these waters since boyhood, had learned their moods and currents during summer days, when the world seemed full of endless possibility. He fought against the river's pull with powerful strokes, angling toward where the child struggled. His hand found her wrist just as she began to sink again, her small fingers like ice against his palm. The current fought him for possession of this fragile life, but Kia's grip was iron forged by years of wielding bow and tomahawk. He pulled her against his chest, feeling her heart flutter like a trapped bird beneath her ribs. The shore seemed impossibly distant as he battled the current, one arm wrapped protectively around the child, while the other fought for purchase against the water's relentless force. Each stroke was a victory measured in inches, each breath a defiance of the river's ancient hunger. Behind them, the rapids roared their disappointment. The struggle against the river's fury seemed to stretch beyond time itself, each moment crystallized in the desperate mathematics of survival. Kia's muscles burned with the effort of fighting both current and cold, his lungs working like bellows as he angled toward a fallen cottonwood that jutted into the water some 30 yards downstream. The massive tree had been claimed by last spring's floods, its root system creating a natural barrier that might offer salvation if he could reach it before his strength failed. The child in his arms had grown frighteningly still, her small body limp against his chest. He could feel the faint flutter of her pulse against his forearm, a fragile rhythm that spoke of life hanging by the thinnest of threads. Her lips had taken on the blue-white pallor of deep cold, and her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps that barely stirred the air between them. Time was becoming their enemy as surely as the river itself. With a final surge of effort that drew upon reserves he had cultivated through years of warrior training, Kia grasped one of the cottonwood's submerged branches. The bark was slick with ice and algae, but his grip held firm as he maneuvered them both toward the relative shelter of the tree's massive trunk. Here, the current's power was broken into eddies and backflows that allowed him to find footing on the rocky bottom. He lifted the child from the water, her small form seeming weightless in his arms, yet heavy with the responsibility of a life that depended entirely upon his actions in the next crucial minutes. Her dress clung to her like a second skin, the fabric dark with river water that dripped steadily onto the snow-covered bank as he carried her toward higher ground. The forest offered little immediate shelter from the wind that had begun to pick up, driving the falling snow in horizontal sheets that stung exposed skin and reduced visibility to mere yards. Kia's trained eye quickly identified a natural windbreak formed by a cluster of boulders and fallen logs, remnants of some ancient avalanche that had carved this particular scar into the mountainside. It would have to suffice until he could get them both to true warmth and safety. He laid the child gently on a bed of pine needles that he quickly gathered, their aromatic oils releasing a sharp, clean scent that spoke of life and resilience. Her skin had taken on an alarming translucency, blue veins visible beneath flesh that felt cold as marble to his touch. The warrior in him recognized the signs of deep cold that could claim a life as surely as any weapon, and with the same methodical precision he brought to tracking wounded game, he began the process of restoration. His own clothes lay scattered along the riverbank where he had discarded them in those desperate moments before the dive. Moving with swift efficiency despite the cold that made his own limbs clumsy, he retrieved his belongings and returned to the makeshift shelter. The beaded vest would provide little warmth, but his buckskin shirt and the heavy buffalo robe he carried for winter travel would serve as barriers against the killing cold. Kia wrapped the child in his shirt first, the soft leather still holding traces of his body heat. Her small hands were like ice sculptures, delicate and beautiful, but frighteningly cold to the touch. He enclosed them within his own palms, breathing warm air across her fingers, while silently calling upon the healing spirits his grandmother had taught him to honor in times of great need. The buffalo robe came next, its thick fur creating a cocoon of potential warmth around her fragile form. But warmth alone would not be enough if her spirit had begun its journey toward the ancestor lands. He needed fire, and he needed it quickly, before the wet cold could complete what the river had begun. His fire kit had remained dry in the waterproof pouch at his belt, a small miracle that might mean the difference between life and death in the next hour. With hands that trembled only slightly from cold and urgency, he began the ancient ritual of coaxing flame from flint and steel, gathering the driest tinder he could find among the sheltered spaces beneath the largest boulder. The first spark seemed impossibly small against the vastness of the wilderness and the magnitude of the task before him. But Kia had learned patience from his elders, had been taught that the greatest victories often began with the smallest actions, performed with absolute dedication. He nursed each spark with the gentle persistence of a prayer, breathing life into tinder until the first tentative flames began to dance. As the fire grew from whisper to voice to song, its warmth began to push back against the cold that threatened to claim them both. The child's breathing seemed to deepen slightly, though she remained unconscious, lost in whatever dreams or visions visited those who had touched the edge of the spirit world and returned. Kia settled beside the fire, keeping vigil over this small life that had been placed in his care by forces beyond his understanding, while the storm gathered strength around their fragile sanctuary. Dawn broke reluctantly over the Montana wilderness, its pale light filtering through the storm clouds that had finally begun to disperse after hours of relentless snowfall. The fire had burned steadily through the night, Fed by Kia's careful attention and an endless supply of deadfall from the surrounding forest, he had not slept, choosing instead to maintain his vigil over the small form that lay wrapped in buffalo hide beside the glowing embers. The child stirred as the first rays of sunlight touched her face, her eyelids fluttering like butterfly wings against the growing brightness. Kia watched with the intense focus of a hunter observing prey, noting each subtle change in her breathing, each slight movement that suggested the return of strength to limbs that had been claimed by the river's cold embrace. Her skin had regained some of its natural color during the night, the deadly blue pallor fading to reveal the healthy pink of restored circulation. When her eyes finally opened, they were the color of summer sky reflected in still water, wide with confusion and the lingering echoes of whatever dreams had carried her through the dark hours. She blinked slowly, her gaze moving from the dancing flames to the towering figure of the warrior who sat cross-legged beside the fire, his dark eyes holding depths of concern and relief that transcended the barriers of language and culture. Kais had spent the long night hours studying her features, trying to piece together the mystery of how a child so young had come to be alone in the wilderness, struggling against waters that showed no mercy to the innocent or unprepared. Her dress, though simple in design, was well made from quality fabric that spoke of a family with means. The small silver locket that hung around her neck bore intricate engravings that suggested European craftsmanship, perhaps a treasured heirloom passed down through generations. Yet there were no signs of a search party, no distant calls echoing through the forest that might indicate family or friends seeking a lost child. The snow had covered any tracks that might have led to answers, leaving only questions that hung in the crisp morning air, like the mist that rose from the warming earth. The child attempted to sit up, her movements tentative and uncertain, as strength slowly returned to muscles that had been pushed beyond their limits. Kia moved closer, his large hands gentle as he helped support her weight, noting how she seemed to accept his assistance without fear. There was something in her manner that suggested she had encountered kindness from unexpected sources before, a trust that spoke of a spirit not yet broken by the harsh realities of frontier life. As she became more alert, her gaze began to wander beyond their small sanctuary, taking in the vast expanse of wilderness that surrounded them on all sides. The confusion in her eyes deepened, and Kia could see the moment when memory began to return, bringing with it a shadow of fear that darkened her expression like clouds passing over the sun. Her small hands moved instinctively to the locket at her throat, fingers closing around the silver pendant, as if drawing strength from whatever memories or connections it represented. The gesture was so unconsciously protective that it spoke of recent loss, of something precious that had been threatened or taken away. Kia recognized the signs of a spirit that had been wounded by more than just the river's cold embrace. The warrior rose smoothly to his feet, moving with the fluid grace that marked him as one who belonged to these wild places. He began to gather their few possessions, his movements economical and purposeful as he prepared for the journey that lay ahead. The child could not remain in the wilderness, regardless of whatever circumstances had brought her to this place. She needed shelter, proper food, and the care that only civilization could provide. Yet as he worked, Kia found himself troubled by questions that had no easy answers. The nearest settlement was Fort Benton, a hard day's ride through terrain that would challenge even an experienced traveler. The child was in no condition for such a journey, despite the remarkable resilience she had shown in surviving the night. More troubling still was the mystery of her presence here, so far from any established trail or homestead. The morning sun climbed higher, its warmth beginning to penetrate the forest canopy and drive away the last vestiges of night's chill. Steam rose from their drying clothes, and the child's breathing had settled into the steady rhythm of restored health. But beneath the surface calm, Kia sensed currents as treacherous as those that had nearly claimed her life. Something had driven this child into the wilderness alone, something that might still pose a threat to her safety. Until he understood the nature of that danger, he would remain her protector, a guardian appointed by forces beyond his control, but not beyond his honor. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what choices would be made in the growing light of this new day. The journey toward Fort Benton began as the sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows through the pine forest that stretched endlessly in all directions. Kia had fashioned a travois from fallen branches and strips of hide, creating a makeshift carrier that would allow the child to rest while they covered the difficult terrain ahead. She had accepted his ministrations with the quiet dignity of one far older than her years, though her eyes continued to hold secrets that seemed too heavy for such a young soul to bear. As they moved through the wilderness, Kia's trained senses remained alert for any sign of pursuit or danger. The snow had stopped falling, but the white blanket that covered the forest floor would make their passage visible to anyone with tracking skills. He chose their route carefully, following game trails and rocky outcroppings that would minimize their tracks while still allowing progress toward their destination. The child dozed fitfully as the travois glided over the snow, her small hands never releasing their grip on the silver locket that seemed to anchor her to memories she could not yet share. In her sleep, she murmured words in a language that sounded like English mixed with something else, perhaps German or Dutch, suggesting origins far from this untamed frontier. The cadence of her whispered words carried undertones of distress that made Kia's jaw tighten with protective instincts he had not expected to feel for a stranger. By mid-afternoon, they had covered perhaps half the distance to Fort Benton when Kia detected the first signs that they were not alone in the wilderness. Smoke rose in a thin column from somewhere ahead, too straight and controlled to be a natural forest fire, too isolated to be from the fort itself. He brought their small procession to a halt beside a cluster of granite boulders that would provide both concealment and a vantage point from which to observe. The child awakened at the cessation of movement, her blue eyes immediately alert despite the exhaustion that still marked her features. She seemed to sense the change in Kia's demeanor, the subtle shift from traveler to hunter that transformed his entire bearing. Her gaze followed his as he studied the distant smoke, and something in her expression suggested recognition, or perhaps fear of recognition. Kia left her sheltered among the rocks while he moved forward to investigate, his moccasined feet finding silent purchase on the snow-covered ground. Years of hunting had taught him to become one with the landscape, to move like shadow and wind through terrain that would betray a less skilled traveler with every step. The smoke led him to a small clearing where 3 men had made camp beside a frozen stream. They were not trappers or traders, despite their rough frontier clothing. Something in their manner spoke of men accustomed to taking what they wanted rather than earning it through honest labor. Their horses were too fine for common drifters, their weapons too well maintained for casual travelers. Most telling of all was the way they studied the surrounding forest, their eyes constantly scanning for signs of movement with the wariness of men who expected trouble. The largest of the 3 wore a coat that had once been expensive, though it now bore the stains and wear of hard travel. His face was marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, giving him a perpetually sinister expression that was enhanced by eyes the color of winter ice. When he spoke to his companions, his voice carried the authority of one accustomed to command, though the words were too distant for Kia to distinguish. The second man was younger, with the nervous energy of someone eager to prove himself through violence. His hand rested constantly on the grip of his pistol, and his gaze darted between his companions and the forest with the restless intensity of a predator seeking prey. The third member of their group remained silent, but there was something in his stillness that suggested coiled danger, like a snake preparing to strike. As Kia watched from concealment, one of the men produced a small object from his coat pocket, something that caught the afternoon light and reflected it in brief, brilliant flashes. Even at this distance, the warrior could see that it was a piece of jewelry, perhaps a brooch or pendant that matched the general description of the locket the child wore. The implications sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the winter air. These men were hunting something or someone. The careful way they examined the jewelry, the systematic manner in which they studied their surroundings, the quality of their equipment, despite their rough appearance, all of it pointed to a pursuit that was both organized and determined. Kia retreated as silently as he had approached, his mind already calculating distances and alternatives as he returned to where the child waited among the granite sentinels. The return journey to where the child waited seemed to stretch across an eternity of careful footsteps and controlled breathing. Kia's mind raced through possibilities and strategies as he navigated the treacherous terrain between the hunters' camp and their temporary refuge among the granite boulders. Each shadow could conceal an enemy. Each sound might herald discovery, yet he moved with the fluid precision of one who had learned to dance with danger since childhood. When he reached the child, her eyes immediately searched his face for answers to questions she could not voice. The intelligence behind those summer blue eyes was remarkable for one so young, suggesting a mind that had been forced to mature beyond its years through circumstances that remained shrouded in mystery. She clutched the silver locket more tightly as she studied his expression, as if the pendant could somehow protect her from whatever truths he might reveal. Kia knelt beside her, his large hands gentle as he checked the bindings on the travois and adjusted the buffalo robe that kept her warm. The three men in the clearing posed a threat that could not be ignored, but neither could they remain exposed in their current position. The granite outcropping provided temporary concealment, but it would become a trap if their pursuers discovered their location. The warrior's tactical mind assessed their options with the cold precision of one who had survived countless dangerous situations through careful planning and decisive action. Fort Benton remained their ultimate destination, but the direct route would take them dangerously close to the hunters' camp. A detour through the high country would add days to their journey and expose them to weather that could prove as deadly as any human threat. Yet there was a third option, one that appealed to the part of him that had been shaped by generations of warriors who had defended their people against overwhelming odds. Rather than flee from the threat, he could eliminate it entirely, removing the danger that stalked this innocent child through the wilderness. The three men were skilled and well-armed, but they were also overconfident, expecting to hunt prey that could not fight back. The child seemed to sense the direction of his thoughts, her small hand reaching out to touch his arm with surprising firmness. There was something in her gesture that spoke of wisdom beyond her years, a understanding that violence, even in defense of the innocent, carried consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate moment. Her touch reminded him that his primary responsibility was her safety, not the satisfaction of warrior instincts that demanded confrontation with those who threatened the helpless. Kia made his decision with the swift certainty that had served him well in countless hunts and battles. They would take the high trail, accepting the additional hardship in exchange for avoiding direct confrontation with the hunters. The child's welfare took precedence over all other considerations, including his own desire to face the threat head-on. He began dismantling their temporary camp with efficient movements, erasing all signs of their presence among the rocks. The ashes of their small fire were scattered and covered with snow. The depression where the child had rested was filled and smoothed. Even the marks left by the travois were carefully obscured. When he finished, the granite outcropping appeared as untouched, as if no human foot had ever disturbed its ancient solitude. The high trail began as a barely visible game path that wound upward through increasingly dense forest toward the snow-covered peaks that dominated the horizon. It was a route that would test both his endurance and the child's resilience, but it offered the advantage of terrain that few men would choose to follow, especially those more accustomed to the easier paths of civilization. As they began their ascent, Kia could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sensation prickled along his spine like the touch of invisible fingers, though his careful observation of their surroundings revealed no sign of pursuit. Perhaps it was simply the weight of responsibility he felt for the small life that depended upon his protection, or perhaps it was the instinctive awareness of a predator who sensed other hunters moving through his territory. The afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson that spoke of beauty and danger in equal measure. Behind them, somewhere in the forest they were leaving, three men continued their methodical search for prey that had slipped beyond their immediate reach. The hunt was far from over. The high trail proved as treacherous as Kia had anticipated, winding through terrain that seemed designed to test the resolve of any who dared venture into its frozen embrace. Ancient pines clung to impossible slopes, their roots finding purchase in cracks between granite faces that rose like cathedral walls toward a sky that had turned the color of old pewter. The air grew thinner with each step of their ascent, carrying the sharp bite of altitude that made every breath a conscious effort. The child bore the hardships with remarkable stoicism, though Kia could see the toll the journey was taking in the shadows beneath her eyes and the way her small hands trembled, despite the warmth of the buffalo robe. She had not complained once during their climb, accepting each jolt and sway of the travois with the quiet endurance of one who had learned that survival sometimes demanded silence in the face of suffering. As evening approached, they reached a natural shelf in the mountainside, where wind-carved stone created a shallow cave that would provide shelter from the elements. The opening faced east, away from the prevailing winds that carried the promise of another storm building beyond the western peaks. Here they could rest without the immediate fear of discovery, though Kia remained alert to every sound that echoed through the mountain stillness. He gathered deadfall from the stunted pines that grew in the shelter of the rock face, building a small fire that would provide warmth without creating enough smoke to betray their position to anyone searching from below. The flames danced against the cave walls, casting shifting shadows that seemed to bring the ancient stone to life, with patterns that spoke of spirits and stories older than memory. The child watched the fire with an intensity that suggested she found comfort in its steady glow, her fingers still wrapped around the silver locket that had become her anchor in a world suddenly stripped of familiar landmarks. In the firelight, Kia could see that the pendant bore an intricate engraving, a tree with spreading branches that seemed to embrace a small house nestled among its roots. The craftsmanship was exquisite, speaking of European artisans and family traditions that had somehow found their way to this untamed frontier. As the night deepened around their small sanctuary, Kia found himself studying the child's features with growing concern. Despite her remarkable resilience, she was beginning to show signs of the strain that came from prolonged exposure to cold and fear. Her breathing had developed a slight wheeze that spoke of lungs challenged by the thin mountain air, and her skin had taken on a translucent quality that suggested her body was drawing upon reserves that would not last indefinitely. The warrior knew they could not remain in the high country much longer without risking her health, yet descending too quickly would expose them to the hunters who undoubtedly continued their search in the valleys below. The dilemma weighed upon him like a physical burden, each option carrying risks that could prove fatal to the small life that had been placed in his care. From somewhere far below came the distant sound of horses moving through the forest, their hoofbeats muffled by snow, but still audible to ears trained to detect the subtlest variations in the mountain's natural symphony. The hunters had not abandoned their pursuit, despite the difficulty of the terrain and the approaching darkness. Their persistence spoke of motivations that went beyond simple opportunism, suggesting stakes high enough to justify extraordinary effort and risk. Kia moved to the cave entrance, his dark eyes scanning the moonlit landscape that spread below their elevated position. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast tapestry of shadow and silver that could conceal an army or reveal a single careless movement to those who knew how to read its secrets. Somewhere in that wilderness, three men continued their methodical hunt, driven by purposes that remained as mysterious as the child's own origins. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, the faint but unmistakable smell of wood smoke from a fire much larger than their own carefully controlled flame. The hunters had made camp for the night, probably in the same clearing where Kia had first observed them. They were settling in for a prolonged search, confident that their quarry could not escape the net they were slowly tightening around the mountain. As he returned to the fire, Kia made a silent promise to the sleeping child and to whatever forces had brought them together in this frozen wilderness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult choices, but tonight she was safe under his protection. The mountain kept its ancient vigil around them, indifferent to human struggles, yet somehow sheltering those who sought refuge in its stone embrace. The first light of dawn crept across the mountain peaks, like a cautious animal testing unfamiliar ground, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold that belied the danger lurking in the valleys below. Kia had maintained his vigil throughout the night, dozing only in brief intervals, while his senses remained attuned to every sound that might herald the approach of their pursuers. The child had slept more peacefully than he had dared hope, her breathing steady despite the thin air and the stress of their desperate flight. As morning strengthened, the warrior made a discovery that changed everything. While gathering snow to melt for drinking water, he noticed fresh tracks in a sheltered depression near their cave, the unmistakable prints of unshod horses moving in single file along a hidden trail that wound around the mountain's eastern face. The tracks were recent, made sometime during the night while he had been focused on the sounds coming from the valley below. The implications struck him with the force of a physical blow. The hunters had not remained in their comfortable camp as he had assumed. Instead, they had divided their forces, sending at least one rider along the high trails while the others maintained their position below. It was a tactical maneuver that spoke of military training and experience in tracking human prey across difficult terrain. Kia studied the tracks with the intensity of a scholar reading ancient texts, noting the depth of the impressions, the spacing between steps, and the subtle signs that revealed the horse's condition and the skill of its rider. What he discovered filled him with cold certainty. They were being hunted by someone who possessed tracking abilities that rivaled his own, someone who understood the mountain's secrets and knew how to use them. The child stirred as he returned to the cave, her blue eyes immediately alert despite the early hour. She seemed to sense the change in his demeanor, the subtle shift from protector to hunted that transformed his entire bearing. Her small hand moved instinctively to the silver locket, and for the first time since he had pulled her from the river, Kia saw something in her expression that might have been recognition, or perhaps the terrible understanding that their pursuers were closer than either of them had realized. The warrior's mind raced through their dwindling options as he prepared for immediate departure. The high trail ahead led to a narrow pass that would funnel them into a natural bottleneck, where a single skilled marksman could command the entire route. Behind them, the tracks suggested that retreat was no longer possible without confronting whoever had followed them up the mountain during the night. Yet there was a third possibility, one that required abandoning the relative safety of established trails for the treacherous uncertainty of unmarked wilderness. To the north, a series of interconnected ridges offered a route that would take them away from both the pass and the lower valleys, where the main body of hunters waited. It was a path that would challenge even his considerable skills, requiring them to traverse exposed slopes where a single misstep could send them tumbling into chasms that had no bottom. As he secured the child in the travois and gathered their few possessions, Kia found himself thinking of his grandfather's stories about the ancient warriors who had defended their people against impossible odds. Those legendary figures had succeeded not through superior numbers or weapons, but through their willingness to take risks that their enemies would never consider, to venture into places where only the desperate or the divinely protected could survive. The morning sun climbed higher, its light revealing the stark beauty of the mountain landscape that surrounded them on all sides. Somewhere below, men with unknown motives continued their relentless pursuit of a child whose only crime seemed to be her very existence. The silver locket at her throat caught the sunlight and reflected it in brief, brilliant flashes that seemed to signal defiance against the forces that sought to claim her. Kia shouldered the travois and began their descent toward the northern ridges, carrying his precious burden into a wilderness that offered no guarantees except the promise that courage and determination might yet triumph over superior numbers and resources. The mountain watched their progress with ancient, impassive eyes. The northern ridges proved to be a landscape carved by gods who understood both beauty and terror in equal measure. Kia navigated the treacherous terrain with the sure-footed grace of one born to such places, though even his considerable skills were tested by slopes that seemed to defy the very concept of safe passage. The child remained silent in the travois, her trust in his abilities absolute, despite the obvious dangers that surrounded them with each precarious step. By midday, they had reached a vantage point that offered a commanding view of the valleys below, and what Kia saw there filled him with both relief and wonder. Fort Benton lay spread before them like a promise of civilization in the wilderness, its wooden walls and smoking chimneys speaking of safety and human community. More importantly, the settlement bustled with activity that suggested the arrival of a military patrol or trading expedition, enough people to provide protection for one small child against whatever forces pursued her. The descent toward the fort required 3 hours of careful maneuvering down slopes that would have challenged a mountain goat, but Kia's determination never wavered. The child had grown increasingly pale during their ordeal, her breathing shallow and her grip on the silver locket weak with exhaustion, yet her eyes remained alert, watching the approaching settlement with an expression that mixed hope with something that might have been recognition. As they drew closer to Fort Benton's gates, Kia began to understand the true nature of the drama that had unfolded in the wilderness. A small crowd had gathered near the main entrance, their attention focused on a woman whose golden hair and fine clothing marked her as someone of importance, despite the obvious signs of distress that marked her features. She stood beside a military officer whose bearing suggested both authority and deep concern, while several other figures maintained a respectful distance that spoke of deference to grief. The child's reaction to seeing the woman was immediate and profound. Color returned to her cheeks, as if life itself was flowing back into her small form. and her hand released its death grip on the locket for the first time since Kia had pulled her from the river. The silver pendant caught the afternoon sunlight and reflected it toward the group at the fort's entrance, creating a brief but brilliant signal that drew every eye in their direction. The woman's response was electric. She broke away from her companions and ran toward them with a speed that spoke of desperate hope finally rewarded, her fine dress trailing in the snow as she covered the distance between them. Behind her, the military officer shouted orders that sent soldiers running in multiple directions, their movements suggesting preparations for defense against threats that might still be approaching. Kia brought the travois to a gentle stop and carefully lifted the child from her nest of buffalo robes, supporting her weight as she took her first unsteady steps toward the approaching woman. The reunion that followed transcended language and cultural barriers, speaking instead to bonds that connected souls across any distance or danger. Mother and daughter came together in an embrace that seemed to heal wounds that went far deeper than those inflicted by cold water and mountain trails. As the woman held her child close, her eyes met Kia's over the small golden head, and in that gaze he saw gratitude that would last lifetimes and recognition of a debt that could never be fully repaid. The military officer approached with measured steps, his hand extended in the universal gesture of respect between warriors, while behind him, the fort's gates opened to reveal sanctuary that had been earned through trials that would become legend. The silver locket lay open in the child's palm, revealing a miniature portrait of the woman who now held her safe, and beneath it, an inscription in flowing script that spoke of love that endured beyond all earthly trials. The tree engraved on its surface had found its meaning at last, a family reunited beneath branches that offered shelter from every storm. In the distance, 3 riders appeared on a ridge overlooking the fort, their silhouettes dark against the afternoon sky. They watched for a long moment before turning their horses away, their hunt finally ended by forces greater than their determination or skill. The mountain had kept its promise, delivering the innocent to safety through the courage of one who understood that some responsibilities transcended all personal considerations. Thank you for joining us for another Indigenous Love Stories journey. If this story made your heart beat a little faster, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments which part touched you the most. Every gesture helps carry these tales of love, courage, and hope even further. Until our next ride.